It was the first snow of the year when Thomas Whitlock, cattle baron of Dry Willow County, reined in his horse at the edge of town and stared across the street like he'd seen a ghost. The wind carried the scent of smoke and horse dung, but all he noticed was her, Eleanor Price, standing near the depot, coat threadbare, hair tied back with a piece of twine, holding a baby in each arm. Her shoulders were hunched, lips cracked, and her face, once the face of the only girl he ever loved, looked hollowed out by something harder than time. He didn't move. Couldn't. The people passed her by like she wasn't even there. Some turned away. Others offered coins without looking. But she didn't look at them either. Her eyes were focused on the babies, soft words whispering from her mouth like prayers or lullabies. He couldn't tell which. Thomas's jaw clenched. Not because of her being there, begging, dirty, alone, but because 10 years ago, he left her without a word. Rode off to buy land, chase cattle, make a name. Promised he'd send for her once things were settled. He never did. And now here she was, carrying something that looked too much like punishment. He dismounted, his boots crunching on the frozen dirt. The same folks who'd ignored Eleanor looked at him now, their eyes lighting up. Everyone in Dry Willow knew who Thomas was. The Whitlock name was stitched into the land like barbed wire. They nodded, tipped hats, moved aside. That's what power did. It bent the world to your walk. But Thomas wasn't thinking about power just then. He was thinking about secrets, not just the one he carried, but the 1,000 tiny ones that led a woman like Eleanor to be standing in the snow with 2 babies and nowhere to go. He crossed the street. "Ellie," he said. His voice didn't sound like his own. More like a boy again, 20 and still dumb with dreams. She looked up slow, her eyes dark and cautious. She didn't smile, didn't cry, didn't even blink. "I don't need charity," she said flat. Thomas nodded once, but his gut twisted. She always could read him before he opened his mouth. He should have known that wouldn't change. "You don't," he agreed. "But maybe the twins do." That got her. Her jaw tightened, and she pulled them in closer, like he might reach out and take one. He didn't, just stood there and took the cold silence that sat between them like a wall. "Where's their father?" he asked, careful not to put heat in the words. He couldn't help it, though. Something sour burned in his throat. She didn't answer right away, just stared at him like she was debating if the truth was worth sharing. "Dead," she said finally. 3 weeks ago. And just like that, his breath caught. Grief had a smell, and it clung to her like wood smoke. The babies, barely a year old if that, started fussing. She hushed them, rocking back and forth with that tired rhythm of someone who'd done 1,000 times with no help. "You got somewhere to stay?" he asked. She laughed under her breath, dry and bitter. "If I did, you think I'd be out here?" Thomas looked away. The buildings across the street blurred as something pressed behind his eyes. Guilt, maybe, or regret. They felt the same sometimes. "Come on," he said, jerking his head toward his wagon. "You can't be out here with them. I'm not going with you. You're not staying here." The snow picked up again, soft flakes melting against his coat, clinging to the baby's thin blankets. One let out a low, tired whimper. That did it. Eleanor stared at him a long time. Then, with her jaw set hard, she shifted both babies to one side and followed him. She didn't thank him. She didn't need to. The Whitlock Ranch sat just outside of town, 3,600 acres of good land, fat cattle, and paid hands who knew not to ask questions. The main house had thick oak floors, oil lamps in every room, and a kitchen that hadn't gone cold in years. But when Eleanor stepped inside, she looked at it like it was a trap. "You can sleep in the guest room," Thomas said, setting down a basket of firewood. "Plenty of space." She nodded, but her eyes kept moving, like she expected someone to jump out from the shadows and take what little she had left. The babies were quieter now, bundled on the couch beside her, their tiny hands clinging to her shawl. "What happened, Ellie?" he asked, voice low. "Last I heard, you married a shopkeeper in Lark Hollow." She didn't look up. "Yeah, I did." And she was quiet for a long time. Then she reached for one of the babies, adjusting his blanket. His name was Isaac. He ran a feed store. At first, it was fine. He was kind. After the twins came, things changed. Thomas felt something twist in his gut again. He drank, he asked. She gave the slightest nod and gambled. He got into trouble with the wrong people. Started talking about leaving town, skipping out on debts. One night, they came for him. I don't know what they did, but he didn't come home. I waited a week, then packed what I could and left. Didn't have anywhere else to go. You should have sent word. She finally looked at him. Her eyes were rimmed with red, but clear. To you? After the way you left. He didn't answer, because he didn't have one. The days passed slow after that. Eleanor kept to herself, cleaned up after the babies, cooked meals without being asked. But she didn't talk unless spoken to. Didn't ask for anything. Thomas watched her from a distance, each day feeling more like a man being held up to a mirror he didn't want to look into. His ranch hands started asking questions. Why was a stranger woman staying in the house? Who were the kids? Thomas didn't answer. Didn't need to. They knew better than to push. One night, he found himself standing by the fireplace, watching the flames lick the logs like they had something to say. Eleanor sat nearby, one baby asleep on her chest, the other nestled in a basket of quilts. You still sing to them? He asked. Her eyes flicked to him, then back to the fire. When they let me, you used to sing to me. She didn't respond. He leaned against the mantel. I was a fool back then. Thought I needed to become someone first before I could give you anything. You could have just stayed. He nodded. Yeah, I know that now. For the first time, he saw something in her crack, just a little. The corner of her mouth twitched. But then she looked at the flames again. I don't need fixing, Thomas, she said. I'm not some project you can mend to feel better about yourself. I know. I'm not staying forever. He didn't argue. He just watched the fire and let her believe whatever made her feel safe. But something about her presence, her silence, her sadness, the way she moved through the house like she was trying not to take up space, started stirring up the past. And it wasn't just the past. It was the fact that Eleanor had been in Lark Hollow. The same Lark Hollow where Thomas had a deal going on the side. A deal he never talked about. Something about a cattle exchange that ran through hands too dirty to touch in daylight. Isaac Price. That name hadn't meant anything to him at first. But then one of the men he used to run cattle with showed up. Slim Carter. Face like a dry riverbed. Isaac never stopped moving. You housed that Price woman, Slim said, leaning on the corral fence. You know her husband owed men money? A lot of it. Thomas's chest tightened. I heard. Some folks think she might have taken something. Maybe stashed it before she ran. Thomas said nothing. Slim spat. I'd keep an eye on her, if I were you. When Thomas turned back toward the house, he saw Eleanor standing in the window, her face pale, the babies nowhere in sight. She'd heard, and now, everything was about to crack open. The town of Dry Willow had long learned to whisper behind closed doors. Beneath its dusty surface, where the church bell rang on Sundays and the saloon spilled over with card games by dusk, power shifted like sand, and no one wielded it more tightly than Thomas Whitlock. But power, as he knew too well, didn't come without enemies. Or secrets. It wasn't just Slim Carter who'd taken notice of Eleanor's return. Others were watching. Sheriff Alden Black, for one, tall, thick-mustached, and quieter than most lawmen needed to be. He'd once been Thomas's closest friend, back when they were boys scrapping over rusted spurs and stolen apples. But something had soured between them. Now the sheriff nodded too slow, asked too few questions, and kept showing up uninvited at the Whitlock ranch with one hand near his pistol. Alden hadn't always been this cautious. But years ago, during a cattle dispute that turned into a fire, one that burned down an entire barn and left a man dead, Thomas's name had surfaced. Nothing ever stuck. No one could prove Thomas had anything to do with it. But Alden had started keeping records after that. Quiet ones. Now, with Eleanor back, Alden's eyes lingered too long. Not just on her, but on the way Thomas watched her. Then there was Lizzie Talbot, the widow who ran the general store with a ledger tighter than any banker's. For the past year, she'd been dancing around Thomas like a moth near oil light. bringing pies to the ranch, asking about fencing contracts, suggesting he might need a woman's help with things as men couldn't do. She was sharp, pretty, in that clean way prairie women sometimes stayed. And she didn't like seeing Eleanor's shawl hanging on the Whitlock coat rack. Strange how folks crawl back to town when there's something to take. Lizzie had muttered one afternoon, her voice light as lace, eyes locked on Thomas as he weighed oats. "She's not here for that," he'd replied, too fast. "Aren't they all?" But the thing was, Lizzie wasn't just some jilted woman with romantic hopes. Her father, back in Kansas, had been a banker. She understood land deeds, cattle contracts, and quiet leverage. She had helped Thomas move money around once, during a dry season when the cattle market dipped and some names had to be kept off papers. Lizzie knew too much, and her smile, once warm, now carried weight. Out on the edge of town, another man had begun stirring the dust, Caleb Dyer. He wasn't for Dry Willow. He'd ridden in on a pale gelding, asking questions in a calm voice and spending too long staring at the old church records. He posed as a traveling preacher, though no one ever saw him pray. He took meals at the boarding house and listened more than he spoke. Eleanor passed him once, walking from the apothecary, and froze like she'd seen lightning strike. Thomas noticed. "You know him?" he asked that night. Eleanor had shaken her head, but not quickly enough. "No, just his eyes remind me of someone." Thomas didn't press, but something about the way Dyer lingered near town, never getting close, started to scratch at his instincts. He didn't dress like a drifter, didn't ride like one either. And he watched the Whitlock ranch from the ridge like he was waiting for a signal. Even Thomas's own men weren't above suspicion. Jack Bellamy, his foreman for 7 years, had recently started making trips into town that lasted too long and came back with too little explanation. He'd grown more withdrawn, refused to meet Thomas's eye. Thomas had trusted Jack once, let him brand cattle and settle land disputes. But now there was a tension between them, like an unspoken test was coming and only one of them would pass. And through all of it, Eleanor moved like a ghost. She spoke little, worked hard, kept her babies fed and dry. But her eyes flicked to windows too often. She checked the latch on her door 3 times every night. And when the wind whistled wrong, she'd sit bolt upright in bed, clutching one of the twins against her chest like the walls might cave in. One night, Thomas caught her staring out at the barn from the back porch, arms wrapped tight across her chest. "You're looking for someone?" he said gently. She turned toward him, tired. "No, I'm hoping no one's looking for me." He didn't ask more. He just stood there beside her, staring into the night. But the misdirection had already started. People whispered about Eleanor, about the babies that bore no resemblance to Isaac Price, who'd been fair and ginger-haired, about the timing of her husband's death, about the coincidence of her showing up at the richest man's door the same week a shipment of Whitlock cattle turned up missing halfway to Kansas City. Even Eleanor noticed. She heard Lizzie's voice behind her in the store, heard the shifting of conversations when she entered the chapel. She felt the town turning the way dry grass bends before a fire. But Eleanor had secrets too. One of them had to do with the night her husband died. Another with a box buried deep in the lining of her travel trunk, wrapped in cloth, stitched shut, containing papers with names that weren't hers. Names she hadn't dared speak out loud. Names tied to debts, land rights, and a child born years before the twins. She hadn't planned to come to Dry Willow. Not at first. But when she saw Thomas's name on a cattle ledger, one Isaac had hidden in their shed, her choice was made. She needed protection, not kindness, not love, just enough shelter to make sure no one could take the babies from her. And as for Thomas, he didn't know whether he brought her in out of guilt or something older. But he was starting to question everything around him. Why had Slim Carter come back into town so suddenly? Why had Alden reopened the records from the cattle fire years ago? Why was Lizzie suddenly talking to Jack Bellamy behind closed doors? And why did Caleb Dyer ride out every morning before dawn and return with dust on his coat that didn't belong to Dry Willow? The answers weren't lining up. and Thomas had always been good at reading trails. Something was off. Everyone had a story, but not all of them could be true at once. By the second week, Eleanor had stopped asking when she'd leave. She started keeping a pistol beneath the floorboard of the nursery. Thomas saw her slide in one night and said nothing. He understood, too, well, the kind of fear that made you sleep with a weapon near your babies. Then one afternoon, a note arrived at the ranch, folded and signed. Just 4 words. You don't know her. Thomas stared at it a long time. The handwriting was neat, measured, but the threat was clear. He burned it in the hearth. Later that night, he asked Eleanor if she'd ever been to Arizona Territory. Her eyes narrowed. Why, she asked. No reason, he lied. But in truth, he'd heard something in town. A story about a woman who vanished from Prescott after a man was found dead in his parlor. A woman with dark eyes and twin infants. A woman riding under a false name. And now, every kindness felt like a wager. Every silence, a test. The players were set. The town was watching. And the truth was curling beneath the surface like a snake in tall grass, waiting to strike. The first real crack came during a late-night storm, the kind that rolled in fast and loud over the prairie, shaking windows and setting the cattle restless. Thomas had just finished boarding up the south barn doors when he saw the lamp flicker in the nursery window. He rushed inside, boots dripping, and found Eleanor crouched over the crib, pistol in hand, her breath coming hard and fast. What happened? He asked, keeping his voice low. Someone tried the back door, she whispered. I heard it. Then footsteps on the porch. Thomas moved fast, sweeping through the house, rifle ready. But whoever had come was gone, left nothing but wet prints in the mud, half smudged by the rain. He didn't sleep that night, neither did she. And in the morning, Jack Bellamy was gone too. No note, no explanation, just his saddle missing and his bunk empty. That was when Thomas stopped pretending he wasn't at war. He doubled the night watch. He hired 2 new ranch hands from out east, quiet men with fast reflexes. He ordered Eleanor to keep the twins indoors and started going through his ledgers line by line. Somewhere between the missing cattle, Slim Carter's visits, and Eleanor's arrival, a pattern was forming. He just hadn't connected the threads yet. Then Lizzie Talbot made her move. She arrived at the ranch under the guise of delivering dried apples and wool. But the moment the door shut, she turned on Thomas like she'd been holding back too long. She's lying to you, Lizzie said, removing her gloves slowly. That woman, Eleanor, you don't even know where she came from. Thomas said nothing, just watched her. That made her angrier. She's using you, Tom. You're a rich man, and she's desperate. You don't think it's strange your husband ends up dead, and days later, she shows up on your doorstep with babies that could pass for yours. He stepped closer. That's enough. No, it isn't. She's not who she says she is. And if you won't see that, the whole town will. Lizzie left the apples on the table and stormed out. Thomas didn't follow, but her words followed him for days after. The babies, the timing, the way Eleanor flinched at every knock on the door. That same week, Sheriff Alden Black rode out to the ranch with a look Thomas hadn't seen since they were boys hiding a dead mule in the arroyo behind the schoolhouse. You got 5 minutes? Alden asked, swinging down from his horse. They sat on the porch while the wind played through the dry brush. I looked into that feed store fire in Lark Hollow, Alden said, watching Thomas's face carefully. Real odd the way it went up. You ever known molasses to burn like lamp oil? Thomas shook his head. You think she did it? Alden shrugged. I think someone wanted her husband dead. I think someone covered it up too well for it to be some drunk's accident. She didn't even have matches on her when she came here, Thomas said quietly. She had a baby in each arm. Alden leaned in. You think that clears her? They sat in silence. When Alden left, Thomas went upstairs and opened the bottom of Eleanor's trunk. He told himself it wasn't spying. He needed to know what was under his roof. But what he found chilled him more than he expected. Old letters. Dozens. Some in Isaac's hand. Some in a woman's. Eleanor's mother, perhaps. Some with government stamps and the names of men he didn't recognize. One name repeated too often, Walter Fielding. Another letter mentioned land fraud, missing cattle, and a forged contract signed in Dry Willow 5 years ago. One letter simply said, "I warned you. If he finds out, he'll come for the children." Thomas put the trunk back and didn't say a word to Eleanor that night. But something changed in him. Not just doubt, fear. For her, for the twins, for himself. Later that week, the body of Jack Bellamy turned up in the riverbed, half-eaten by coyotes. Shot once in the back. The sheriff called it an accident. Thomas called it a message. Slim Carter showed up again soon after, this time without pretending. He rode straight up to the house, dismounted, and didn't even knock. "You got something that don't belong to you," Slim said, tossing a stone between his hands. Thomas didn't move. "You're trespassing." Slim smiled. "So she. What do you want?" "I want what she took." Isaac owed money. Real men. Dangerous ones. She ran with more than just her kids. She didn't take anything. Then she's lying to you too. Slim stepped forward. "You think it's a coincidence? Your cattle go missing. Your man turns up dead. And the widow of a debt-ridden shopkeeper shows up, just transmit to her in distress." Thomas's fists clenched. But deep inside, the questions were growing. Was Eleanor really running from gamblers? Or was she running from something worse? That night, Eleanor finally broke. She found Thomas on the porch, sat down beside him without asking, and stared into the dark. "I didn't burn the store," she said. He didn't look at her. "Then who did?" She was quiet for a long time, then said, "Isaac made a deal with a man named Fielding. Something about cattle. Fake land contracts. He needed quick money. I didn't ask questions. I was nursing the twins, barely sleeping. He said we'd move west, start over. I didn't know he'd signed your name on one of the contracts." Thomas turned sharply. "What?" Eleanor nodded. "Your name. The Whitlock brand. He used it to make the sale look clean. Fielding helped him. Then the deal went bad. The men wanted their money. I don't know what happened after that. I came home and found blood on the floor. The twins crying. Isaac gone." Thomas sat back, stunned. The forged contract. The missing cattle. His name tied to fraud. No wonder Alden was sniffing around. "Why didn't you tell me? I thought if you knew, you'd send me away." He let the silence hang. The babies cried faintly inside. Eleanor didn't move to go to them. "I buried the papers," she said finally. "The ones with your name. I didn't know what else to do." A wind gust shook the porch. Dust whipped into the air. "I don't care about the papers," he said. "I care if someone's coming for you. For the kids." She looked at him then, and for the first time since she returned, he saw tears not from fear, but shame. "I didn't come back to trap you, Tom. I came because you were the only man I knew who wouldn't look away." He believed her, but it didn't matter anymore. They were already in too deep. Whoever Fielding was, he wasn't finished. The next morning, Caleb Dyer revealed himself. He arrived in town with no disguise, no cross on his coat. He walked straight to the sheriff's office and handed over a warrant. Not for Eleanor. For Thomas. Fraud. Conspiracy. Theft of cattle across state lines. Alden rode to the ranch with 2 deputies. Thomas met him at the gate, calm as the dawn. "I'll come," he said. "But you know this isn't the whole story." Alden nodded. "It never is." Before he was taken, he turned to Eleanor and said only this: "Burn the letters. All of them." And she did. But when she opened the trunk, a new envelope sat on top, one she hadn't seen before. Inside, a birth certificate, not for the twins, for a third child. Father, Walter Fielding. Mother, Eleanor Price. Her hand shook. The storm outside gathered again, dark clouds rolling like judgment over the plains. She understood now why Fielding had chased them, why Isaac had died, why Thomas was being dragged through the mud. The stakes were never about money. They were about blood, lineage, legacy. And now, Eleanor had to decide, run again or stay and fight for the life she'd started to believe in. The thunder cracked, and somewhere beyond the hills, hoofbeats echoed. Someone was coming. Again, the morning the town turned on Eleanor, the wind blew from the east, sharp and cold, like the past had finally caught up. By noon, word had spread across Dry Willow. Thomas Whitlock had been arrested. The most powerful man in the territory now sat behind bars, charged with fraud, cattle theft, and conspiracy. Men who used to tip their hats to him now whispered his name like it was something foul. And the woman at the heart of it all, the one who'd knocked on his door holding 2 infants and nothing else. Well, they stopped pretending they didn't blame her. At the general store, Lizzie Talbot slammed shut the ledger book when Eleanor walked in. "You still think he's going to protect you from that cell?" Lizzie asked, not even bothering to lower her voice. Eleanor stood her ground. "He didn't do what they're saying." "Oh, honey." Lizzie's voice dripped with false sympathy. "You don't have to lie to us. We all know how men behave when there's a woman like you crying in their bed." Eleanor left the store empty-handed, head held high, heartbreaking. It wasn't just the words. It was the way people looked through her now, like she was a story they'd grown tired of pretending to believe. But she didn't have time for shame. She had the twins. She had questions. And she still had Caleb Dyer's name echoing through her bones like thunder. Because it wasn't over. Not even close. The betrayal started small. A missing ledger page here. A rider spotted near the ranch boundary there. But by the time night fell, the pieces were falling faster than she could pick them up. Jack Bellamy's sister came to town that evening, saying Jack had sent her a letter before he died, saying he was scared. Said Thomas was keeping secrets from everyone, even Eleanor. Said Thomas had paid a man in Kansas to silence a witness. Eleanor didn't believe it. Couldn't. But the seed was planted. The fracture between her and Thomas began to widen. Not because she didn't care, but because she didn't know what to believe anymore. The man who had taken her in, who'd fed her children and kept them safe, he hadn't told her everything. And that silence began to feel more like distance. She sat alone on the porch night after night, holding one twin or the other, staring out into the prairie and wondering whether she'd built her trust on sand. Then came the letter from Walter Fielding. It arrived in a gray envelope. No return name, just her first name scrawled across the front in ink that bled from the humidity. She opened it with trembling hands. "Eleanor, you should have known better than to run. You stole something from me. You think just because Isaac's dead that this ends? I want what's mine. The boy was never his. You know that. And if I don't get him, I'll take everything else. You have 3 days." Then I stopped being polite. WF. She read it 3 times, then tore it into pieces and burned it in the hearth. But she didn't sleep that night. She held the boy twin, James, close to her chest and whispered, "You are mine. He will never touch you. Not ever." But Walter Fielding didn't deal in threats he didn't intend to carry out. The next morning, the Whitlock ranch hand Javier was found unconscious near the cattle fence. Pistol whipped, mouth gagged, a warning note pinned to his shirt. "One child, or we burn it all." Sheriff Alden took the threat seriously. He rode out, tried to convince Eleanor to leave town under protection. But she refused. "I ran once," she told him. "It got Isaac killed. I run again, it'll get someone else hurt." The tension in town tightened like a noose. Caleb Dyer started riding out at night again, visiting properties on the edge of town. No one knew who he worked for, but he had the confidence of someone with authority and the cold precision of a man who had killed before. And through it all, Thomas sat behind bars, stripped of everything that had made him untouchable. But even from jail, he kept moving pieces. He passed a note to Eleanor through Alden. Only 5 words. "Lizzie was never your friend." Eleanor sat with that for hours before it sank in. It made sense in a way. Lizzie had always been around just enough to help, but never enough to care. She had access to Thomas's business accounts. She delivered papers. She had her hands in everything but her name on nothing. And worse, she had known Walter Fielding. Back before Lizzie was a widow, her husband, Charles Talbot, had worked for Fielding's land company. There had been lawsuits. Quiet ones. Settlements that disappeared. Fielding's name had shown up in the Talbots' court records, buried under pseudonyms and aliases. Eleanor realized with a sickening lurch Lizzie hadn't just been watching from the sidelines. She'd been playing both ends, helping Fielding move money while pretending to help Eleanor survive. The rage that burned in her chest nearly swallowed her. She waited until after sundown and went to confront Lizzie at the general store. The place was empty, closed early, but Lizzie was still inside, counting the till, holding a pistol under the counter. "I know what you did," Eleanor said, stepping into the room. Lizzie looked up slowly. "You'll have to be more specific, darling. You told Fielding where I was. You've been feeding him information this whole time." Lizzie's eyes narrowed, but her voice stayed calm. "I did what I had to do. You brought danger here. I just made sure it didn't land on my doorstep." Eleanor moved closer. "You sold us out. Me. My children." Lizzie leaned forward. "You think you're the only mother in this town who's ever had to make hard choices? You used Thomas like a shield, and now you're shocked someone else made a move before you did." Eleanor stared at her, truly looked, and saw the rot underneath the charm, the ambition, the bitterness. "You're worse than Fielding," Eleanor said. "At least he doesn't pretend to care." Lizzie smirked. "Then maybe you should give him what he wants." Eleanor walked out shaking, teeth clenched, fists ready. She knew now there was no middle, no compromise. Someone was going to bleed before this ended. The next day, Fielding arrived. Not in secret, not in shadow. He rode in with 2 hired guns and a smile like winter. Dismounted in front of the jailhouse and walked in like he owned the place. Alden stood. "You're not welcome here." Fielding raised a paper. "I'm not here for you. I'm here for my son. Legal custody. Birth certificate's valid. Mother's unstable. Living with a known criminal. I'll take the boy." Alden stared at him. "You think I'm that stupid?" Fielding didn't blink. "I think you're tired. And I think everyone has a price." That was when Thomas spoke from his cell. "Try it," he said. "Just try to touch them. You won't leave this town breathing." Fielding turned to him, amused. "You're in a cage." Thomas grinned, wild and reckless. "You really think that ever stopped a man like me?" Later that night, Eleanor sent the twins away with Javier and the 2 new ranch hands riding north under moonlight. She gave them false names, paid them in gold, swore them to silence. "I'll deal with Fielding," she said, "but they don't come back until it's safe." She knew what she was doing, knew what was coming. She kissed her babies, held them longer than she should have, and then stood back while they disappeared into the dark. She walked home alone, barefoot in the dust, arms empty, a pistol in her belt. When she got there, Fielding was waiting. On her porch, drinking from one of Thomas's glasses. "I wondered if you'd run again," he said. "Not this time." He stood. "You can't win." "I don't need to win," she said. "I just need you to lose." He stepped toward her, hand on his belt. She didn't flinch. "Where are they?" he asked. "You'll never see them again." He reached for his gun. So did she. The shot rang through the valley like a scream. A light in the sheriff's office flared. By the time Alden got there, Fielding was dead. Eleanor was on the porch, blood on her dress, pistol at her side. "He was reaching," she said, voice flat, eyes empty. Alden looked at her a long time, then nodded. "Self-defense," he said. They'd buried Fielding behind the jail. No one mourned. And the next morning, Thomas was released. The charges didn't stick. Not with the paper trail Lizzie accidentally left behind. Signed contracts, forged letters, banking records that tied her to Fielding and several known rustlers. The entire town turned again, whispered a news story. By week's end, Lizzie was gone. Disappeared in the night, her store boarded up, her name scratched off every polite conversation. Thomas came home to his silent ranch. Eleanor stood by the barn, dirt on her hands, eyes tired but unbroken. "They're safe," she told him. "They'll stay gone until it's time." He nodded. "I'd like to meet them. Someday." She turned toward him. "When it's safe." They didn't hug, didn't kiss, just stood there, 2 people who'd seen too much and survived it anyway. Whatever came next, it would be honest. And finally, that was enough. The wind picked up just before sunrise, stirring the red dust across the empty main road of dry willow. The town felt thinner now, like the air had been pulled too tight across something ready to snap. Eleanor stood on the porch of the Whitlock ranch, staring at the horizon. She'd sent the twins north, and she hadn't heard back. That silence gnawed at her more than any gunshot ever could. Then came a knock. Thomas opened the door to find Caleb Dyer, hat pulled low, coat speckled with trail dust. But this time he wasn't alone. Sheriff Alden was behind him, holding a piece of paper that looked too clean to belong in this kind of story. "There's something you need to see," Alden said, handing it to Thomas. "And she needs to see it too." Eleanor stepped forward, reading over his shoulder. It was a deed transfer, one from nearly 6 years ago. A document giving Walter Fielding full guardianship over a male child to be born of Eleanor R. Martin. Signed not by her, but by Isaac Martin. Thomas turned, his face pale. "He signed away your child?" Eleanor blinked, lips parting. "No, he wouldn't have. He didn't even know the child wasn't his." "Exactly," Alden said grimly. "That's the catch. The paper wasn't legal. It was a forgery. Walter had known Isaac never suspected, but it had been enough to delay the court and nearly ruin everything. That document, it turned out, had been drafted and witnessed by Lizzie Talbot herself. Her signature was there in ink, stamped next to a false notary. The truth was heavy, but it was only the start. As Eleanor and Thomas read it again, Caleb reached into his coat and pulled out something else. A letter, one of many that had been recovered from Lizzie's abandoned store. This one was addressed to Caleb himself. He read it aloud, voice hardening as he went. "You think she's clean, Caleb? You think she didn't know what Isaac was doing before he died?" Eleanor knew. She let him sell cattle that didn't belong to him. She was the bookkeeper. She signed the ledgers. Don't let her fool you. She doesn't love Thomas. She's surviving, just like always. Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth. "That's not true. None of that's true." Caleb met her eyes, and for the first time since she'd known him, he looked unsure. "I don't know what to believe anymore," he said. The air snapped. Thomas stepped between them, shoulders squared. "I do. You trust me?" Eleanor asked, desperate. "I know what it feels like to be blamed for something someone else planned." He turned to Caleb. "That letter is a trap. She didn't write those books. I did. I signed those ledgers. I covered Isaac's trail because I thought it would help her. That's my guilt, not hers." Alden nodded slowly. "Lizzie wanted us all pointing guns at each other. Because the real storm is coming." They all turned. "What storm?" Eleanor asked. Alden answered. "Fielding had a brother, Albert. He's coming. And he's got men, real ones. Not ranch hands. Gunslingers. Paid in gold and whiskey. And he wants vengeance." They didn't have long. That evening, Dry Willow turned into a fortress. Thomas called in every favor, summoned every old ally, and gave them one job: protect the town, protect the children, protect Eleanor. He didn't say it out loud, but everyone saw it in his face. This was going to end in blood. Just before sundown, Albert Fielding rode in with 7 men behind him. They didn't stop at the saloon. It didn't bother hiding. Alden tried reason first. Met them at the edge of the square. "You want to file a claim? Fine," he said. "We'll do it legal." Albert smirked. "We did legal. Your jailhouse made it meaningless. Now we try something older." His men drew first. The gunfire cracked the evening in two. Eleanor dropped to the ground behind the watering trough, hands over her head, as Thomas shoved her behind a wagon wheel. Caleb fired from the rooftop, Alden from the church steps, Javier from the hayloft of the Whitlock barn. It wasn't a long fight, but it was a brutal one. 2 townsfolk were wounded. One of Albert's men was killed outright, and Albert, bleeding from his arm, retreated behind the livery stable with a hostage, a young stable boy named Owen who had done nothing but look out the wrong window at the wrong time. Thomas went after him, alone. Eleanor ran to stop him, but Caleb held her back. "He has to," he said, "for all of us." Inside the stable, it was quiet but tense. Thomas could hear the boy whimpering, could hear Albert's breath, tight, angry, desperate. "I'll trade you," Thomas said calmly. "Let the boy go. You get me." Albert laughed. You think I came for you? I came for the girl. The whore who stole my brother's kid. Thomas stepped into the light. Then shoot me. You already lost once. Might as well finish losing. Albert didn't. He looked into Thomas's eyes, and something in him crumbled. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was that old guilt he never buried right. But in that moment, he blinked, and Thomas surged forward. One shot. Quick. Precise. Albert collapsed, gun clattering to the ground. The boy was safe. The town was quiet again, but the price had been steep. Later that night, Eleanor stood beside Thomas on the ranch porch. Blood on his shirt, dust on her face. Caleb sat nearby, arm bandaged, face unreadable. I didn't want this, Eleanor whispered. I just wanted to raise them quiet, away from all this. I know, Thomas said. She looked at him, and I didn't lie to you. Not about Isaac, not about the ledgers. I didn't know he was moving money. Thomas nodded. I believe you. But Caleb didn't speak. Instead, he stood. I'm leaving, he said. I was here to settle a debt. It's settled. Eleanor stepped forward. You're not even going to say goodbye. He looked at her, soft and sad. Goodbye, Eleanor. And just like that, he was gone. The aftermath wasn't easy. Alden wrote reports that never got filed. Townsfolk cleaned up blood that stained the wood deeper than whiskey ever could. The twins came home 2 weeks later, unaware of what had almost happened to them. And Eleanor? She made her choice. She asked Thomas to leave, not out of anger, but because she needed to raise her children without owing anyone anything. Not even him. You saved us, she told him, voice thick. But now I have to learn how to live without looking over my shoulder. Thomas nodded. Didn't argue. He kissed the twins' foreheads, packed a bag, rode west, and Eleanor, for the first time in her life, stood alone, scared, free, and finally herself. Dry Willow would talk for years. About the night the Fieldings came. About the woman who stood her ground. About the Baron who gave up everything for a woman who would never belong to anyone. But Eleanor never talked much about that time. She just raised her children, kept the books honest, tended the porch garden, and when her daughter asked, years later, Mama, did you ever love anyone? She smiled faintly and said, I loved, yes. But not all love is meant to stay. And that was enough. The sun rose slower the next morning, or maybe it just seemed that way. Dry Willow looked washed out, as if the land itself was finally breathing again. The gun smoke had settled, the shouting was over, but the choices made the night before hadn't vanished. They hung in the air, heavy as a storm that never quite passed. Eleanor stood on the edge of the Whitlock field, watching the cattle drift along the ridge. Her hands were sore from holding too much, her children, her past, the truth. But now, with Albert Fielding buried and the lies cracked open for all to see, there was nothing left to hide behind. Word traveled fast. Some folks called Thomas Whitlock a fool for walking away from everything. Others called him a hero. But the man himself didn't say a word. He wrote a letter before leaving. A plain one. Left it under Eleanor's kitchen lamp. I didn't fix everything. I only stopped it from getting worse. You don't owe me a future, Eleanor. You owe yourself one. It wasn't romantic, but it was real. And for Eleanor, that mattered more than any promise ever had. Caleb Dyer was gone too. He didn't take revenge, didn't stay for closure. Maybe he realized that some ghosts weren't his to chase. Or maybe he couldn't bear to watch Eleanor choose peace with someone else. Either way, he left no message. Only his silence, which said more than words ever could. Lizzie Talbot's name stayed blackened. Sheriff Alden made sure her false notarizations and secret dealings were posted across town. The Talbot store was boarded up. Her name was scratched off every church roster and town record. But no one really cheered about it. She'd been one of their own, greedy, yes, but part of the town's bones. Her fall didn't feel like justice. It felt like being pulled from a wound that had festered too long. And Walter Fielding? His brother dead, his schemes exposed, his hands legally tied. He wrote to Eleanor once more, this time from a jail in Kansas, where he awaited charges on fraud and coercion. He didn't apologize, just warned her to keep the children away from names like his. That was his version of guilt, cold and halfway honest. As for Eleanor's children, they never really understood all of it. Just that Mama had been strong, and men with guns had come and gone, and somehow the world had kept spinning. Eleanor started fresh. She sold half the cattle, paid off old debts, and bought a small parcel of land on the edge of town. Close enough for safety, far enough for quiet. The schoolhouse took her on as an assistant bookkeeper, and the townsfolk who once whispered about her now nodded kindly when she passed. Time didn't erase what happened, but it softened the edges. One evening, 2 years later, Eleanor stood outside that little schoolhouse while her children played behind her. A stranger rode into town, dust trailing behind him. He wore a worn hat, leaned slightly to one side in the saddle. For a moment, her heart paused. But it wasn't Thomas. It wasn't Caleb. Just another traveler with a story not yet told. She smiled anyway. Somewhere deep inside, she still held the memories, not just of pain, but of survival, of the love that tried, the men who left, and the one who stayed just long enough to put her on her own 2 feet. Life in Dry Willow moved on. Buildings changed hands. Names faded, but people remembered. They remembered the Baron who walked away from power. They remembered the woman with twins who begged in the dust and ended up owning her name again. And in time, when the stories were told to newcomers and children too young to know better, there was always one line that made folks pause and wonder. She gave everything up to be free, and somehow that made her the richest one of all.